Hello and welcome everybody, I'm Opium, and this is Victoria 3's Dev Diary number 40. Today we have the Opium Wars, a very interesting topic because it is one of the defining moments in East Asian history, in Chinese history, leading down the road that would of course lead to the downfall of the Great Qing. This is very important because these sort of things, without railroading it, still need to be represented in a good way, or otherwise you have a freeform sandbox where you just wildly blob. This is a defining situation, a defining moment, a defining crisis for this area. Similar to, for example, the German unification, the Italian unification, the Balkan Wars, all of these things. Now, EU4, Victoria 3 and the devs made it very clear that they don't want you to be railroaded into these, but they want to have basically a skeleton be all around you that makes it so that there is likely this situation or a similar situation going on, and for this they are extensively using journals. Very interesting dev diary. The release date is not in here, but what is in here is the explanation for how this journal entry can deal with this crisis. So let's jump in. The Opium Wars and introducing the concepts of cultural obsessions and religious taboos is today's topic. We already heard about these. We never really talked about this in detail. We talked about this greatly on the channel when it comes to hypothesizing about it. We talked about the notion of, for example, if I am a Han pop, so a Han Chinese cultured pop that lives in America, do I pick up the same obsession as the pops that are at home in China? And the answer to this is yes. It will be revealed later in the text. We're going to get to this, but we also already, and I'm basically at peace with this, even though when we debated this, I said I wish that it would be market specific. So unless these pops are within the market that triggered this obsession, it shouldn't happen. But I also basically talked about it at that point, that like that just shuffles cultures around in a way where you don't ever really care for that culture. It might make it so that you know, yes, you have Han Chinese in your market, but they don't have this quirk. They are not interesting to you outside of being Han Chinese per se, but they don't have this interesting obsession. I think doing it worldwide is actually not a bad choice, but that was really the conclusion that we had months ago as well, because otherwise it just wouldn't work. Now, in the 1830s, China was ravaged by opium addiction. The impact was severe and broad in its effects. Despite attempts by the Qing government to restrict imports, British merchants continued to illegally flood the market. The situation came to a head when Qing officials ordered the seizure and destruction of opium in Canton, to which the British responded with force. The First Opium War resulted in crushing defeats for the Qing government and began an era of unfavorable and humiliating treaties with the Western powers. This is, I think, similar to how Germans, and in particular the Prussian nobility, perceived the end of the 30 Years' War that left them ravaged despite wanting to be neutral. I believe that this is one of the defining moments for China and for East Asia as a whole, because of course it is a regional interconnectivity right there, and it is very, very important that it plays a role. Let's jump in how it actually works. We represent the Opium Wars through journal entries and events. Qing China begins in the midst of this crisis, but it is also possible for other unrecognized countries to experience this content if the in-game conditions are appropriate. I assume... Oh man, I wonder whether when they say this, and maybe they mention in the dev diary, but these dev diaries, they're so long, I keep forgetting what I read when I marked all of this, but I wonder whether this just means if China falls apart, you can still have these sort of opium addictions? Or do they mean, if for example, I take a treaty port in Japan and flood them with opium, I can cause this very same opium crisis? I believe we already saw, I want to say in the Ottoman Empire, that if you have a lot of opium in your realm that is meant to be utilized for your army because it could be one of the production methods or it could be used in it, and you are currently not using it, that you could also cause an opium crisis yourself, basically. What the actual details there are, I'm very, very curious, but as far as I remember, it is not mentioned in this dev diary. The Opium Crisis event applies harsh negative modifiers to standard of living throughout your country. Very important. Standard of living is what makes people happy, basically. To your mortality rate, that is also very important. I mean, you don't want to shrink. And to the effectiveness of your military forces. This one is even bigger, because of course it makes sense. They are sort of, being undermined by this situation, making it so that ultimately you fight worse, the organization is worse, maybe corruption gets worse. All of these are critical, and all of these are something that the player will have to and will want to address. So let's take a look at this event. Opium Crisis event in Beijing. Opium addiction is ravaging Great Qing. Vast numbers of Han people have become opium fiends, causing a wave of crime, poverty and idleness. Despite the obvious harm, Great Britain continues to flood the market. I wonder whether Great Britain can be exchanged here. I assume that if this is true, that any unrecognized country that you can take a treaty port from, That this could, for example, if you're Portugal and your opponent is Japan, that it could say Japan and then the Japanese people, and Portugal continues to flood the market. Very cool. This is the flexibility that I'm very interested in, but of course it is primarily tailored around China. Every household has a bed-bound opium fiend, every street corner has an opium den, and every port welcomes British merchants, pouring a glut of opium down the throats of any who will pay for it. We have to do something, or we cannot risk the ire of Great Britain. And this is very important, because of course everything you're doing here is something you are doing against, or with, or because of one of the great powers, one of the colonizers, essentially. This is a good time to talk a little more about cultural obsessions. A culture can become obsessed with a specific good. Pops of that culture, regardless of where they are in the world, important, will spend significantly more on goods they are obsessed with compared to other goods in the same pop needs category. So in the case of opium, Han Pops will spend a lot more of their wealth buying opium than they do on liquor or tobacco. See, the thing about this is, first of all, this is cool. I like this. I think it's completely feasible that we are saying this is a worldwide obsession. You can always argue that, you know, these cultural trends, these cultural fads that occur in a location, they are also reflected within, for example, an emigrated population. So meaning that, for example, if you are Han Chinese and you are in America, then you may also develop this addiction. This is interesting because it will really make it so that as long as this is worldwide, you as a nation that takes in a lot of immigrants will see the effects that happen completely elsewhere. And that is something that I would definitely call very, very interesting, because otherwise you can just dismiss it. If your Han Chinese pops in America, for example, don't get the addiction, then you will just literally not care. I think this is a good application right here. I do like that, you know, for example, this also means opium will then be favored over liquor and tobacco. Of course, it makes sense. These are substitutes, so this is what you put in there. What I'm curious about is how, for example, a liquor, what the thresholds in general are. These could be compared to cultural situations. So if you take an EU4 situation, this is a situation, except instead of being for a country, it is for a culture group. Now the question is, how do you trigger a liquor obsession, a tobacco obsession, a tea obsession, all that sort of stuff I'm really curious about, but yeah, I don't know. The foreign powers selling opium to China are making a killing, exploiting this demand, so the demand that rises here, and feeding the addiction. Cultures can develop new obsessions over time, and you'll need to react to changes in pop's demands as a result. Again, curious about the details, but these are probably all work in progress. And now, very interesting, religions have taboos against certain goods. For instance, Muslim faiths have a taboo against the consumption of liquor and wine. This has the opposite effect from a cultural obsession. Pops following these religions will spend much less on purchasing that good compared to other goods in that category. So, Muslims will typically buy tobacco and opium instead of liquor, and they will buy tea or coffee instead of wine. Very cool. Very interesting. In love with that, honestly. Now, these are different because unlike obsessions, taboos are static throughout the game. Of course, there will still be people, you know, there will still be pops that are basically paying for liquor and such, because not everybody abides by the rules, but in principle, this culture behaves different in how they purchase something compared to, for example, other cultures like, I mean, Germans is a bad example. No, it's a great example, actually. I guess it's a lot of beer obsession right there, right? Whether that is a genuine obsession, I am not certain. But this is very interesting. Taboos stay static throughout the game. Very important to point out here, because this doesn't change. You could argue that maybe you could technically make it so that you can reform a religion to include a new obsession, or, sorry, a new taboo, but I'll be honest with you, I think that is not within Wiki 3's scope. I don't think Wiki 3 works like this, or should be working like this. It is focused, of course, on other things. This isn't CK3. Beijing is one of the most populated states in the world in 1836. Besides its 19 million people, it's also home to the Forbidden City Monument, a massive government administration sector, as well as a large section of the now-defunct Great Wall. You can see the Great Wall right here. I like it. I like the way this looks. This is really neat. This map honestly looks better and better the more often we see it. And then here we have the Forbidden City. Now, what do we have here? Opium Crisis. I think this tooltip is faulty, but we're going to take a look at this. The following conditions must be true for a total of 5 years, so this is very much like EU4 situations. You need to overcome it for a prolonged amount of time. Great Qing is banning opium, is not at war, and then currently turn 11 markets fulfill this requirement. At least one of these. All trade routes currently 37. I believe what this means is the idea that nobody is currently importing opium into the market, right? That's how I would interpret this. Because you ban it, but if somebody has a treaty port, they can still import it, which is why you need to get rid of the treaty port, and then you can all of a sudden be fine and actually ban it and get out of this opium crisis. It will fail if you enact free trade, or if one of the powers opposing our efforts holds any state, or maybe holds a treaty port. Again, I don't know what this tooltip means, but Very, very interesting, of course. Basically, you need to shut yourself off. You are not allowed to let any of the great powers of the West in particular, but also potentially other great powers, you know, like Japan, for example, you cannot let them have access to your market. That is the fundamental idea. If China, or whichever country is the target, but we'll keep things simple and refer to China from here on out, chooses to confront the issue head-on, the Opium Crisis journal entry will describe the conditions for successfully resolving the issue, as well as the conditions that will cause immediate failure. So failure is immediate, success takes time. China must avoid at all costs enacting the free trade law, as well as resist the attempts of the great powers to establish a treaty port. Both of these are potential war goals, which the AI will strongly prioritize when starting diplomatic plays against China. By resisting the Western powers, China must maintain a total ban on the opium trade. Basically, do or die. That's what this is all about. If you fail, then you will immediately fail this. If you lose one of the humiliating treaty ports or, you know, treaty decisions, then you are in a situation where you fail the opium crisis at the very least for now. And the impact of this can be felt. We're going to see that in a bit later, in a screenshot a bit later. Now, playing as Great Britain for any major opium exporter, you'll have the opportunity to thwart the opium ban through all the usual diplomatic and coercive means at your disposal. It could even be an opportunity to make inroads into China. The Qing government has announced its intent to put an end to the opium trade in Great Qing. As Great Britain is a major supplier of opium, this is a matter of great economic concern. This, as you can see, is an event in the home counties, so basically in London, in the capital, and I really like the symbol here. I think this is a nice way of showing you events without giving you pop-ups, because they now are on the map. That is pretty neat. There are some who decry the so-called moral evils of the opium trade. I say to them, who are you to stand in the way of free trade and the free choices of the consumer? The demand exists, and so we provide. If not us, then some other nation would grow rich off the backs of Han opium fiends. Should every man be deprived of opium simply because some irresponsible ninny hammers abuse it? Should every British family be deprived of the wealth that opium brings to our country? Yeah, that sounds a very interesting sentences there. They will eat their opium and they will like it. This adds opium wars to your journal, or we have other matters to attend to. So you can simply accept it, or you can say, I am coming for you. China's attempts to halt the flow of opium will not go unchallenged. All great and major powers exporting opium to China will receive an event prompting them to decide their stance on the matter. This will add the Opium Wars journal entry to that country, in which their success conditions match the failure conditions for China, so it is directly turned around. Basically, if China stays isolated and can keep itself isolated, of course you failed when it comes to exerting pressure, but if you get a treaty port, you succeed, and the Great Qing fail. You must either force China to adopt the free trade law, or else acquire a treaty port in that nation that allows them to bypass goods bans. So basically, either make it illegal for them to ban goods, or make it legal for you to circumvent bans. That is the idea here. The AI, and indeed the player, is strongly encouraged to start a play with war goals that would complete the journal entry. This is not something that locks you into war immediately. This just says, here's your war goal, here's your idea, go through with it and you will pass the journal entry. It's not really a war goal, of course, it's just a motivation for it. I like this. This doesn't lock you in, it doesn't give you a do or die situation. You can bide your time unless, you know, you are in a situation where the 5 years of China that it can wait until it succeeds are over. If it succeeds, then it's looking at a situation where all of a sudden China may resist you and your journal entry would fail. Free from the ravages of opium addiction and the interference of foreign powers, the strengthened Qing dynasty might avoid or avert the crisis that would historically bring them to ruin. We're gonna see this right there. Very excited for that one, because again, that is the biggest journal entry, the biggest impact a journal entry actually has on gameplay that we have seen so far. The End of Addiction event in Beijing. We've broken the Han dependence on opium through great perseverance. Not even the machinations of Great Britain could prevent us from returning good health and prosperity to Great Qing. Just as the opium fiend shall break his addiction and rise from his idler's bed, so shall our nation cast off the unwelcome yoke of foreign influence and rise as a sovereign state. No longer inundated with opium, our rivers shall flow with silver, and our people shall return to virtuous living. The sovereignty of Great Qing is absolute, or harmony shall return to Great Qing. Manchu stops being obsessed with opium, so that is actually a second culture being obsessed here. Han stops being obsessed. Then Great Qing gets opium recovery, which gives you +2 minimum wealth for 5 years. That is pretty good. That is really good. I wonder if the minimum wealth goes away. Oh, it's just minimum wealth, meaning that, like, the weak is actually being uplifted here. But once it goes away, isn't that bad? Wouldn't they get upset that all of a sudden they are down, you know, by 2 wealth again? Either way, Great Qing loses widespread opium addiction. Look at this. -25% offense and defense. -2 standard of living and +2% mortality. That stuff is insane. Opium Wars, good end. Now, if China succeeds in suppressing the flow of opium while withstanding the onslaught of the great powers, the course of history is altered and the addiction crisis will be resolved. All its primary cultures will lose their opium obsession and the negative modifiers representing the effects of widespread addiction will be removed. Foreign powers repulsed, China has not been forced into the unequal treaties that would lead to further conflict and turmoil. However, Fragile Unity is the broadest journal entry in Victoria 3, encompassing content that can emerge at all stages of the game. For instance, while the stage is already set for the Opium Wars in 1836, the Boxer Rebellion will not happen until later in the game when a stronger sense of Han nationalism has appeared. This is a crazy journal entry right here. Let's take a look at this. A number of factors risk fracturing Great Qing. Each of the following will contribute 20% to the fracturing. Losing the Opium Wars, so that is the journal entry that we just went through. Failing to stop the appearance of the Heavenly Kingdom. I believe they mention it down here that people will radicalize and will maybe turn either to nationalism or to religion, depending on how much you already failed. Then failing to retake the Heavenly Kingdom, failing the Boxer Rebellion, going into default, having a civil war, becoming a subject and abolishing the monarchy. All of these, of course, basically lead you away from the Great Qing and into fracture, because everything that is keeping China together right now is the Great Qing. If you abolish the monarchy, then you might be looking at a situation where the Great Qing will fall apart, because the monarchy was what kept things together. That is the old system. But if you abolish the monarchy and that is the only thing that you fail on here, you can go on. This is so flexible. This is so flexible. I really, really enjoy this. I really like this because it puts you in a situation where you really can, you know, for example, turn radically religious. You can get rid of the monarchy. You can turn radically nationalist unless you have failed various other steps before. Then you must restore and keep alive the old order. I like it. Also, each of the following will detract -20 from the fracturing. Winning the Opium Wars, that's a big one. Gives you more leeway what you can do over here, right? Ceasing to be an unrecognized power, very cool. So if you make it, then of course, you know, you're making your way out of this great crisis. And finishing the Stamp Out Monarchism journal entry. I assume this is basically, if you do take this path, you get a +20, but then you can get rid of that -20 by eliminating the old system. This is cool. This is exactly why I was so damn excited when it comes to the journal entries. We're looking at a situation that is so flexible. You can be the Great Qing, you can come out monarchist, communist, republican, you can be anything and everything between, as long as you do not fail the others. If you fail, you break apart. This is really good storytelling because it doesn't railroad you, it gives you different options on how you can react to crises that may occur in your country, dependent on what happens in your market, what happens to your pops, and so on. This is what I really like about the journal system, and I wish other games would use them as well. I like, for example, and I'm very impressed by what they have done recently, I like what Stellaris is doing with situations. The move towards this, and towards vassalship, of course, what Stellaris is doing there, but the move with the situations is welcome, in my opinion. Situations are, I think, hands down, my favorite feature in EU4. No doubt about it. I mean, at the end of the day, we're looking at a situation where I'm not the biggest fan of EU4, but situations are so good to not railroad you and yet give you this content. This is what this is, but even further. I like it. Failure, however, may have dire consequences. The government will lose legitimacy, radicals will rise across the nation, and turmoil will engulf your states. But that's not the worst of it. Failing the Opium Wars journal entry increases your fragmentation, tracked by the Fragile Unity journal entry. If your fragmentation rises to 100%, it will herald the end of a unified China, with the nation breaking up into a dozen warlord states. Failing the Opium Wars journal entry will indirectly lead to an influx of missionaries into China, which may spark radical uprisings on a scale never seen before. That is what I was talking about. And if exploitative foreign presence in China continues into the era of Han nationalism, the people's demands for sovereignty will shake the foundations of the state and threaten the survival of the Qing dynasty. One great failure can lead to a chain reaction of disaster. Huge, huge fan. These things necessitate one another, but on such a flexible nature, in such a flexible situation, where we finally, hopefully, get an interesting to play China and an interesting to interact with China. This is something I think the previous games did not get right, and I hope that indeed the journal system makes this possible. I am a big, big fan of journals, and this is why. This is basically why. I am very much looking forward to what mods can do with the journal system as well. This is such a wide condition. Just think, for example, and I know every time I say, like, what could mods do, what could mods do, I bring up this mod, but when Sunless Seas, when you think about the idea of what this could be all about, you could talk, for example, about who has control of the Untersee. Is it the crazy people down south, the rebellious people? Is it, for example, London, or is it the Khanate? Who knows? But this would be one of these journal entries. Big fan. In the next week, we have Mikael Andersson, so Lacek, I believe, introducing Victoria III's revolutions, which, honestly, I love this, because Victoria Revolutions is the first... Okay, listen, don't worry about it, okay? Either way, what I'm saying is, revolutions in the next Dev Diary. Very cool, very eager to see how they're going to be doing it. We have already some hints that it looks similar to Hoi 4's revolutions, but currently we don't really know for sure, so very excited to see that. For the moment, I will see you later. Alligator.